The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on Katherine Hayes' slender shoulders as she struggled with two heavy buckets of water from the creek. Sweat trickled down her temple, mingling with the dust that had settled on her sun-kissed face. It was the summer of 1878 in the unforgiving territory of Arizona, and survival was measured in drops of water and ounces of grit. Katherine had been on her own for 3 weeks now, ever since her father had succumbed to a fever that swept through their small homestead. At 22, she was determined to keep their modest ranch running, despite the whispers in town that a woman alone couldn't manage such a task. Those whispers only strengthened her resolve, though on days like today, with the water buckets cutting into her palms and her arms screaming in protest, doubt crept in like a shadow. She paused, setting the buckets down to catch her breath. The small creek that ran through the corner of her property was a blessing, but the daily trek was becoming increasingly difficult. As she flexed her fingers to ease the ache, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. In this part of the territory, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Katherine quickly reached for the small pistol tucked in her apron pocket, her father's final gift to her before he passed. "Never hesitate," he'd told her. "Out here, hesitation means death." A lone rider appeared around the bend, his silhouette imposing against the brilliant blue sky. He rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, the animal's coat gleaming with sweat from the day's heat. The man himself was tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Madam," he called out, slowing his horse as he approached. His voice carried a gentle tone that contrasted with his rugged appearance. "Didn't mean to startle you." Katherine kept her hand near her pistol. "State your business, sir." The stranger dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle. He kept a respectful distance, seeming to understand her wariness. When he removed his hat, she saw his face clearly, for the first time weathered by sun and wind, but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. "Name's Kieran Blackwood," he said. "I'm heading to Tucson, but my horse needed water." His gaze fell to her buckets. "2 hands make it lighter," he offered, gesturing to the water she was carrying. Katherine hesitated. Her father had warned her about the deceptive nature of men with charming smiles, but there was something genuine in this stranger's eyes. Still, she kept her distance. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I manage just fine." Kieran nodded, respecting her decision. "Of course, mind if I water my horse at your creek?" "It's not technically my creek, but I don't mind," Katherine replied, bending to pick up her buckets again. As she struggled to lift them, water sloshed over the rims, darkening the parched earth. Before she could protest, Kieran stepped forward and gently took one bucket from her hand. "I insist," he said, his voice firm but kind. "My ma raised me to help when I see someone in need, regardless of whether they ask for it." Something in his straightforward manner broke through Katherine's defenses. "Your mother raised you well then," she conceded, adjusting her grip on the remaining bucket. They walked in silence toward her small cabin, the only sounds the creak of the bucket handles and the gentle nickering of Kieran's horse as it followed behind. Katherine found herself stealing glances at the stranger. His profile was strong, his jaw set with determination as he carried the heavy bucket without complaint. "You're a long way from Tucson," she observed, breaking the silence. Kieran nodded. "I've been riding circuit with a cattle drive. We delivered the herd yesterday, and the boys are celebrating in town. I'm not one for drinking away my wages, so I decided to head on early." "You're a cattleman, then?" "Among other things," he replied cryptically. "I've been a lot of things in my time. Cowhand, tracker, even tried my hand at mining for a spell. Nothing stuck until I found work with the Whitman outfit." As they approached the cabin, Katherine felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She hadn't invited a man to her home since her father died, and doing so now felt both improper and dangerous. Yet something about Kieran Blackwood put her at ease. "You can set it down by the door," she instructed, stopping at the edge of the small porch. "Thank you for your help." Instead of leaving immediately, Kieran's gaze traveled over the cabin and the surrounding area. His eyes narrowed as he took in the state of the barn roof, which had begun to sag in one corner. "You live here alone?" he asked, then quickly added, "Forgive me, that's not my business." Katherine stiffened. "My father passed 3 weeks ago. I'm managing the place now." Kieran's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Hayes, Katherine Hayes." "Miss Hayes," he said, tipping his hat. "Losing family is never easy. I lost my pa when I was 14, left me and my ma to run our farm in Kansas." "You're a long way from Kansas, Mr. Blackwood." A shadow passed over his face. "Life has a way of taking you places you never expected." He glanced again at the barn. "That roof won't make it through the next heavy rain." Katherine felt a flare of defensiveness. "I'm aware. I plan to fix it once I've harvested what's left of our crops." Kieran looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. He nodded and turned back to his horse, who had wandered to the edge of the yard to graze on the sparse grass. "Well, I should be on my way," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for allowing me to water my horse." As he mounted, Katherine felt a surprising pang of regret at his departure. It had been weeks since she'd spoken to anyone for more than a few moments, and despite her initial wariness, she found Kieran's company oddly comforting. "Mr. Blackwood," she called as he turned his horse. "There's stew on the stove. Not much, but it's hot, if you'd like to rest before continuing your journey." The invitation surprised them both. Kieran studied her face for a moment as if searching for something. Whatever he saw there made him smile, a genuine smile that transformed his rugged features. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Hayes. I accept." As Kieran dismounted once again and led his horse to the small corral beside the barn, Katherine wondered what had possessed her to invite a stranger to dinner. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had settled over her like a heavy blanket since her father's passing, or maybe it was the simple human kindness Kieran had shown in helping her with the water. Either way, she found herself looking forward to having company for the evening, even if it was just for a few hours. Inside the cabin, Katherine stirred the pot of rabbit stew she'd prepared earlier. It wasn't much rabbit, wild onions, and a few dried herbs, but it would be filling. She added more water to stretch it for two and stoked the fire, trying to ignore the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. When Kieran knocked on the door frame and stepped inside, he removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, leaving it slightly tousled. He'd washed up, Katherine noticed, his face cleaner than before, though a day's worth of stubble still darkened his jaw. "Smells good," he said, standing somewhat awkwardly just inside the door. His eyes took in the cabin's sparse but tidy interior, the small table with 2 chairs, the narrow bed in the corner covered with a faded quilt, the shelf of books that had been her mother's pride and joy. "Please sit," Katherine gestured to the table. "It's nothing fancy." "After weeks of trail food, anything homemade is a feast," Kieran assured her, taking a seat at the table. Katherine ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one before him, along with a chunk of bread she'd baked the day before. She sat across from him, suddenly aware of how intimate the small table made their meal seem. "Do you say grace, Miss Hayes?" Kieran asked, his hands hovering above his bowl. The question touched her. "My father always did." Kieran nodded and bowed his head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the kindness of strangers. Bless this house and those who dwell within it. Amen." It was a simple prayer, but it nearly brought tears to Katherine's eyes. Her father had said grace every day of his life, and hearing the words in another man's voice made his absence all the more palpable. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Kieran spoke again. "This is delicious. You're quite the cook, Miss Hayes." "Katherine," she said suddenly. "Please call me Katherine. Miss Hayes makes me feel like I'm in trouble with the schoolmarm." That earned her a chuckle. "Katherine it is then, and I'm Kieran." As they ate, Katherine found herself opening up more than she had intended. She told Kieran about her father, how he'd moved them west after her mother died of consumption 10 years ago, seeking a fresh start. How they'd built this cabin together, how he'd taught her everything from shooting to farming to basic carpentry. "He sounds like a good man," Kieran said, his eyes warm with understanding. "The best," Katherine agreed, her throat tight with emotion, "but the fever took him so quickly." One day he was fine, the next. She trailed off, unable to continue. Kieran reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers briefly. I understand. When my pa died, it felt like the world had dropped away beneath my feet. How did you manage after he was gone? One day at a time, Kieran said simply. My ma was strong like you. We kept the farm going for a few years, but eventually we lost it to drought and taxes. That's when I headed west. And your mother, a shadow crossed his face. She remarried, good man, banker from the next town over. They moved to St. Louis, I write when I can, but... He shrugged, and Katherine understood the unspoken truth that life had taken them in different directions. As they continued talking, the evening light faded into dusk. Katherine lit a lamp, its warm glow creating a cozy circle around their table. She found herself laughing at Kieran's stories of life on the cattle, Drive the cook who threatened to quit every other day, the young cowhand who was terrified of snakes but had accidentally sat on one while bathing in a river. It was the first time she'd laughed since her father died, and the sound surprised her. It's nice to hear you laugh, Kieran said softly. Laughter is good medicine for grief. Katherine studied him, this stranger who seemed to understand her so well. You're not what I expected, Kieran Blackwood. And what did you expect? I'm not sure. Most men who pass through here either want something or are running from something. Kieran's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe I'm a bit of both, not running exactly, but searching. He paused, then added, as for wanting something, well, right now I'd settle for a place to lay my bedroll for the night if you wouldn't mind. I can sleep in the barn. Katherine hesitated. Propriety demanded she refuse. An unmarried woman allowing a man to stay on her property would set tongues wagging if anyone found out. But the nearest town was a half-day's ride, and the thought of Kieran continuing his journey in the darkness didn't sit well with her. The barn would be fine, she agreed finally. There's fresh hay in the loft. Relief flickered across Kieran's face. Thank you, I'll be gone at first light. After they cleared the table, Kieran insisted on helping with the dishes, a task Katherine couldn't remember her father ever volunteering for. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth. When it was time to retire for the night, Kieran collected his bedroll from his horse and bid Katherine good night. I'll see you in the morning, he said, his voice gentle in the darkness. Lock your door, Katherine, she nodded, touched by his concern. Good night, Kieran. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of the cabin settling, Katherine found her thoughts drifting to the man sleeping in her barn. There was something about Kieran Blackwood that intrigued her, a gentleness beneath his rugged exterior, a sadness behind his smile that matched her own. For the first time since her father's death, she fell asleep without tears, the weight of solitude temporarily lifted from her shoulders. The next morning, Katherine woke to the smell of coffee brewing. Confused, she quickly dressed and stepped into the main room to find Kieran standing at her stove, a pot of coffee steaming on the burner. Hope you don't mind, he said, looking somewhat sheepish. Thought I'd make myself useful before I head out. Not at all, she replied, surprised by the thoughtful gesture, though I expected you to be gone by now. Kieran poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to her. I would have been, but I took a look at that barn roof at first light. It's worse than I thought. One good storm and you'll lose half your hay storage. Katherine sighed, cradling the hot cup between her palms. I know, I just haven't had time to address it yet. I could fix it for you, Kieran offered, his tone casual. Wouldn't take more than a day or 2 with the right materials. She stared at him, searching for ulterior motives in his expression but finding only sincerity. Why would you do that? Because you need help, he said simply, and I'm in no rush to get to Tucson. Katherine's pride warred with practicality. The roof did need fixing, and she had no idea when she'd find the time or strength to do it herself. Still, accepting help from a man she barely knew felt like admitting defeat. I can pay you, she said finally. Not much, but something for your trouble. Kieran shook his head. No payment necessary, just a few meals and a place to sleep while I work. That doesn't seem fair. Life rarely is, he said with a small smile, but sometimes we get lucky and find kindness where we least expect it. After breakfast, they rode together into the small town of Cedar Springs, 5 miles from Catherine's homestead. The settlement was little more than a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of houses, but it was the closest place to purchase the supplies Kieran needed for the roof repairs. As they tied their horses outside the general store, Katherine was acutely aware of the curious glances from the few townsfolk on the street. News traveled fast in small communities, and she knew that by nightfall, everyone would be talking about Katherine Hayes riding into town with a strange man. "People are staring," she murmured to Kieran as they entered the store. "Let them," he replied with a shrug. "We're not doing anything wrong." The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, raised his eyebrows at the sight of them together but greeted Katherine warmly. "Miss Hayes, good to see you." "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, thank you," she replied, conscious of Kieran standing beside her. "And who might this be?" Mr. Peterson asked, not bothering to hide his curiosity. "Kieran Blackwood," Kieran introduced himself, extending a hand. "Just passing through and offering some help with repairs at Miss Hayes's place." Mr. Peterson's expression was skeptical as he shook Kieran's hand. "Is that so? Well, we look after our own here in Cedar Springs. Miss Hayes has friends in town who would be happy to assist her." The implication was clear. Why hadn't Katherine asked for help from people she knew, rather than accepting it from a stranger? "Mr. Blackwood is experienced with barn repairs," Katherine said, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. "And my father always said to accept help when it's offered freely." Mr. Peterson's gaze lingered on Kieran for a moment longer before he nodded. "Of course. What supplies do you need?" As Kieran listed the items required for the roof repair, Katherine wandered through the store, picking up a few necessities: flour, coffee, and a bolt of fabric she'd been saving for to make new curtains. When she returned to the counter, she found Kieran and Mr. Peterson engaged in a discussion about the best type of nails for the roofing job. "The galvanized ones will last longer in this climate," Kieran was saying. "Worth the extra cost in the long run." Mr. Peterson nodded grudgingly. "You seem to know your business, Mr. Blackwood." "I've built my share of structures over the years," Kieran replied modestly. As they loaded their purchases onto their horses, Katherine noticed Mrs. Bennett, the preacher's wife, watching them from across the street. The woman's disapproving expression made Katherine's cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Don't let it bother you," Kieran said quietly, noticing her discomfort. "Small towns run on gossip. Give them a week and they'll find something new to talk about." "It's not that simple," Katherine sighed. "My reputation is all I have." Kieran's expression grew serious. "I understand. If my presence is causing problems, I can leave after I get the roof started. You could hire someone local to finish it." The thought of Kieran leaving so soon sent an unexpected pang through Katherine's chest. "No," she said quickly. "You offered to help and I accepted. What the town thinks is their business." They rode back to the homestead in companionable silence. The day had grown hot, and Katherine was grateful for the slight breeze that cooled her skin. Beside her, Kieran rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Have you always been on your own?" she asked, breaking the silence. Kieran considered the question. "Not always. I had family, my parents, an older brother who died in the war. After my ma remarried, I drifted for a while, taking work where I could find it. Spent some time with a rancher in Colorado who treated me like a son. What happened? He died. His real son inherited everything and made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore." The matter-of-fact way he described his losses made Katherine's heart ache. "You've known a lot of grief," she observed. Kieran glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the clear blue of the sky. "So have you. It shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us." Back at the homestead, Kieran wasted no time getting to work on the barn roof. He removed his shirt in the afternoon heat, and Katherine found herself stealing glances at him as she tended her small garden. His back was muscular and tanned from the sun, marked with a few scars that spoke of a hard life. By the time the sun began to set, Kieran had removed the damaged portions of the roof and prepared the framework for the new sections. He climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief. "It's coming along," he told Katherine as she approached with a dipper of water. Should be able to finish it tomorrow if the weather holds. You've done more in one day than I could have managed in a week, she admitted, handing him the water. Kieran drank deeply, then poured the remaining water over his head, sending rivulets streaming down his chest. Many hands make light work, or in this case, one extra pair. That evening, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Katherine had brought out a quilt to ward off the evening chill, and they sat side by side, shoulders nearly touching. My father and I used to sit out here on summer nights, Katherine said softly. He knew all the constellations and would tell me stories about them. Which was your favorite? Kieran asked. Andromeda, she replied without hesitation. The princess who was chained to a rock as a sacrifice but was rescued by Perseus. Kieran smiled. You like tales of rescue and redemption. I suppose I do, Katherine admitted, though these days I'm trying to be my own rescuer. There's strength in that, Kieran said, his voice warm with admiration. But there's also strength in knowing when to accept help. Their eyes met in the dim light, and Katherine felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits finding each other in an unlikely place. Thank you, she said simply. For the roof and for being here. Kieran's hand found hers on the quilt, his touch gentle but sure. Thank you for letting me stay. They sat in silence for a long while after that, hands touching beneath the stars, the vast Arizona sky stretching endlessly above them. The next day passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Kieran completed the roof repairs by mid-afternoon, the new sections blending seamlessly with the old. Katherine had spent the morning baking bread and preparing a special dinner as a thank you for his work. When Kieran finally descended from the roof for the last time, his face was flushed with exertion and satisfaction. It's done, he announced. Should withstand whatever the weather throws at it for years to come. Katherine surveyed his handiwork, impressed by the precision and care he'd shown. It looks better than when my father and I first built it. High praise, Kieran said with a grin. I'll take it. After washing up, they sat down to the meal. Katherine had prepared venison stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie for dessert. It was the most elaborate meal she'd cooked since her father's death, and seeing Kieran's appreciation made the effort worthwhile. This is incredible, he said between bites. You could open a restaurant in Tucson and make a fortune, Katherine laughed. I don't think I'm ready for city life. This land may be harsh, but it's home. As they ate, a comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional clink of silverware against plates. Katherine found herself studying Kieran's face, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he smiled. Tomorrow he would continue his journey to Tucson, and the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. What will you do in Tucson? She asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Kieran set down his fork. There's a cattle operation looking for an experienced foreman. The pay is good, and it would mean settling in one place for a while. That sounds like a fine opportunity. It is, he agreed, though something in his expression suggested uncertainty. Though I admit, the idea of staying in one place feels strange after so many years of moving around. Sometimes roots can be comforting, Katherine said softly, having a place that's yours, people who know you. Is that why you stay here, even alone, for the roots? The question was gentle, but it struck at the heart of her situation. Partly, she admitted, this land was my father's dream. Leaving would feel like abandoning him somehow, but it's also the only home I've known as an adult. I'm not sure who I'd be anywhere else. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. Identity is a powerful anchor. After dinner, they again found themselves on the porch, watching as a brilliant sunset painted the western sky in strokes of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, Kieran would leave, and the thought hung between them, unspoken but palpable. You could stay another day, Katherine found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. If you wanted to rest before continuing your journey. Kieran turned to her, surprise and something else, hope perhaps flashing in his eyes. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't be, she assured him quickly. Besides, there are a few other repairs around the place that could use your expertise. It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it, but Kieran smiled warmly. In that case, I'd be happy to stay another day. Relief washed over Katherine, followed immediately by confusion at her own reaction. Why did the thought of Kieran leaving affect her so strongly? She barely knew the man, yet in the short time he'd been at her homestead, his presence had become a comfort she wasn't ready to relinquish. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the desert night, Katherine found herself thinking about the future. Before Kieran's arrival, her days had stretched before her in an endless, lonely procession. Now she found herself wondering about possibilities she hadn't considered before. It was foolish, she knew, to pin such thoughts on a man who was essentially a stranger. Yet there was something about Kieran Blackwood that felt familiar, as if they'd known each other in some previous life. Morning brought with it a new sense of purpose. Kieran had agreed to stay another day, and Katherine was determined to make the most of it. After breakfast, they tackled the list of repairs she'd mentioned, fixing a loose board on the porch, reinforcing the corral fence, and clearing debris from the creek to improve water flow. Working together, they fell into an easy rhythm. Kieran was patient, taking time to show Katherine techniques that would help her maintain the property on her own. She, in turn, shared her knowledge of the land where to find the best wild berries, which parts of the creek never dried up even in the harshest drought. By mid-afternoon, they had completed most of the repairs and were taking a break in the shade of a large cottonwood tree near the creek. Katherine had brought a jug of cool water and some bread and cheese for a simple lunch. "You're good at this," Kieran observed as they ate. "Ranching, I mean." "Most women I've known would have sold up and moved to town after losing their father." Katherine shrugged. "I considered it. The banker in Cedar Springs made an offer on the property the day after we buried my father, said a woman had no business trying to run a ranch alone." Kieran's expression darkened. "Let me guess his offer was well below what the land is worth." "Half at best," Katherine confirmed, "but it wasn't just the money. This place is all I have left of my father, of my family. I couldn't bear to part with it." "I understand that better than most," Kieran said softly. "When we lost our farm in Kansas, it felt like losing my father all over again." Their eyes met, and Katherine felt that same connection she'd experienced the night before, a recognition of shared pain, shared resilience. "What made you keep going?" she asked. "After you lost everything," Kieran was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Stubbornness at first, then eventually hope. Hope that somewhere out there was a place I could belong again." "And have you found it?" He looked at her then, his eyes serious. "I'm not sure yet, but for the first time in a long while, I feel like I might be getting close." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Katherine felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze and looked away, focusing on the flowing water of the creek. "We should finish the fence before dark," she said, rising to her feet. Kieran nodded, following her lead. "Yes, we should." That evening, after a simple dinner, they sat at the table with a pot of coffee between them. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, drumming softly on the new roof of the barn. "Your roof is holding up well," Katherine observed, glancing toward the window. Kieran smiled. "I should hope so. I'd hate to think I left you with leaky repairs." "You're good with your hands," she said, then blushed at how the words sounded. "I mean, you're skilled at building things." "I understood what you meant," Kieran assured her, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "And thank you. Most of what I know I learned from necessity." "When you're on your own, you either learn to fix things or you go without. Like carrying water," Katherine mused. "Two hands make it lighter, as you said when we met." "Exactly." Kieran's expression grew thoughtful. "Life is easier with someone to share the load." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Katherine took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to gather her thoughts. "Will you leave tomorrow?" she asked finally, her voice quiet against the backdrop of the rain. Kieran studied her face for a long moment before answering. "Do you want me to?" It was a direct question, and Katherine found herself unprepared for it. The proper answer, the one society would expect, was yes. She barely knew this man, and her reputation was already at risk from the days he'd spent at her homestead. Yet the thought of returning to her solitary existence after experiencing the warmth of his company filled her with dread. "No," she admitted softly. "I don't want you to go." Kieran reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Then I'll stay for as long as you'll have me. What about Tucson, the foreman position? There will be other jobs, he said simply. But not everyone finds someone who understands them, who sees them as they are. Katherine felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. We barely know each other. Sometimes a few days tells you more about a person than years could, Kieran replied. I've spent my life moving from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots, but being here with you, it feels right in a way nothing has for a very long time. His honesty was disarming, and Katherine found herself responding in kind. I've been so alone since my father died, not just physically but inside, like part of me died with him, but when you're here I feel whole again. Kieran's hand tightened around hers. I can't promise it will be easy. I'm not a wealthy man and this land demands constant work, but I can promise to share the burden, to make the load lighter. 2 hands, Katherine murmured, turning her palm up to clasp his. 2 hearts, Kieran added softly. The rain continued to fall outside, a gentle lullaby that seemed to cocoon them in their small cabin. In that moment, Katherine knew with certainty that her life had changed irrevocably. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since her father's death, it held promise rather than just endurance. As the days turned into weeks, Kieran and Katherine fell into a comfortable routine. He proved to be a skilled rancher, bringing new ideas and energy to the small homestead. Together, they repaired fences, tended crops, and even purchased a few head of cattle with the money Kieran had saved from his cattle drive work. The townspeople of Cedar Springs were initially skeptical of the arrangement. When Katherine and Kieran attended church together for the first time, whispers followed them down the aisle. But as time passed and Kieran proved himself to be hardworking and honorable, the whispers gradually subsided. Mr. Peterson from the general store was among the first to warm to Kieran, especially after Kieran helped him repair a broken wagon wheel one afternoon when they were in town for supplies. That man of yours knows his way around tools, Mr. Peterson told Katherine as Kieran worked. You chose well. Katherine didn't correct the assumption that they were more than friends, though in truth, their relationship remained proper despite their living arrangement. Kieran had converted a small storage room off the barn into his sleeping quarters, respecting Katherine's reputation even as their feelings for each other deepened. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking about their day, their pasts, their hopes for the future. Katherine found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone about her mother's death, her father's grief, her own fears of failing to keep the ranch afloat. Kieran, in turn, opened up about his life. He told her about his brother's death in the war, how it had changed his family forever. About the years he'd spent drifting from job to job, never quite finding a place that felt like home. About the dreams he'd nearly given up on of having land of his own, a family, roots that went deep. I stopped believing those things were possible for me, he admitted one evening as they watched the sunset. Until I met you. Katherine's heart quickened at his words. And now Kieran's gaze was steady, his voice low and earnest. Now I believe in possibilities again. As summer gave way to fall, the bond between them continued to strengthen. They worked side by side during the day, their bodies moving in a dance of shared labor. In the evenings, they read together from Katherine's small collection of books, Kieran's deep voice bringing the stories to life in a way that made her see them anew. It was during one such evening as they sat before the fireplace with a volume of Emerson's essays that Kieran suddenly closed the book and turned to Katherine. I need to ask you something, he said, his expression serious. Katherine's heart raced. What is it? I've been here for nearly 3 months now, Kieran began, his voice steady despite the nervousness evident in his eyes. In that time, I've come to care for you in a way I never expected. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. I know this might seem sudden to some, but I feel like I've known you my whole life, like everything that came before was just preparing me to find you. Katherine felt tears welling in her eyes as Kieran continued. I don't have much to offer in terms of wealth, he said. But I promise to work every day to make this land prosper, to build a life with you if you'll have me." From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before I left Kansas, said I should save it for when I found someone special." Katherine stared at the ring, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Kieran, Katherine Hayes, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of sharing this land, this life with me?" Time seemed to stand still as the question hung in the air between them. In that moment, Katherine saw their future unfold before her, the homestead flourishing under their combined care, children running through the fields, growing old together on the porch watching sunsets. It was everything she hadn't known she wanted until Kieran came into her life. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Kieran's face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the promise it represented, a future they would build together. As he leaned in to seal their engagement with a kiss, Katherine felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, conveying all the love and commitment words couldn't express. When they finally parted, Kieran pressed his forehead against hers. "Two hands," he murmured. "Two hearts," she replied, completing what had become their private mantra. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Cedar Springs. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, their initial skepticism transformed into genuine well wishes for the couple who had defied convention to find happiness together. Katherine wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Kieran looked handsome in his best clothes, his face alight with joy as she walked down the aisle toward him. The preacher, who had initially been among the most concerned about their living arrangement, now beamed as he pronounced them husband and wife. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," he declared, his voice ringing through the small church. Their kiss was brief but tender, a promise of the life they would share. As they turned to face their neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Katherine felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The hole left by her father's death would always be there, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she was defined by the love she had found with Kieran, by the future they would build together. The celebration continued at their homestead, with neighbors bringing food and good wishes. Mr. Peterson had donated a barrel of cider for the occasion, and Mrs. Bennett, who had once looked so disapprovingly at Katherine, presented them with a handmade quilt for their marriage bed. "Every stitch is a prayer for your happiness," she told Katherine, embracing her warmly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. They stood on the porch, watching as the last wagon disappeared down the road. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood," Kieran said, his arm around her waist. "How does it feel to be a married woman?" Katherine leaned into his embrace, savoring the warmth of his body against hers. "Wonderful, perfect, like coming home after a long journey." Kieran turned her to face him, his expression serious despite the joy of the day. "I want you to know something. I may not have much in terms of worldly possessions, but everything I am, everything I have is yours. We're partners in this life, equal in all things." His words touched Katherine deeply. In a world where women were often considered little more than property once they married, Kieran's view of their union as a partnership was a precious gift. "And all that I am is yours," she replied softly. "Together we'll make this land thrive, we'll build something lasting." Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, a culmination of the love that had grown between them over the months. As they lay together afterward, Katherine's head on Kieran's chest, she listened to the steady beating of his heart and marveled at how completely her life had changed since that hot summer day when he had found her struggling with buckets of water. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about the day we met," she admitted. "How close I came to sending you on your way without a second thought." Kieran chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly beneath her ear. "You were right to be cautious. A woman alone has to be careful. But something made me trust you," Katherine mused. "Something in your eyes, perhaps, or maybe it was just fate." I like to think it was a bit of both, Kieran said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Some things are meant to be, but we still have to choose them. The winter that followed their marriage was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold that tested their resolve, but within the walls of their small cabin, they created a haven of warmth and love. In the evenings, as the wind howled outside, they would sit before the fire, planning for the spring, for the future they would build together. Katherine discovered she was pregnant just as the first signs of spring began to appear. The news filled them both with joy and a renewed sense of purpose. Kieran became even more protective, insisting on handling the heaviest chores despite Katherine's protests that she wasn't an invalid. "I know you're strong," he would say, his hand gentle on her growing belly, "but let me do this for you, for our child." As her pregnancy progressed, Katherine found herself reflecting on the twists of fate that had brought them together. If Kieran hadn't happened upon her that day at the creek, if she hadn't invited him to stay for a meal, if he had continued on to Tucson as planned, how different her life would be now. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd gone to Tucson?" She asked him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Her belly was round now, their child active within her. Kieran considered the question, his hand resting protectively on her stomach. "Sometimes. I imagine I would have taken that foreman job, worked hard, maybe saved enough to buy a small place of my own eventually." He shook his head. "But I would have always felt like something was missing. I just wouldn't have known what it was." "And now?" Katherine asked, covering his hand with her own. "Now I have everything I never knew I needed," he replied simply. "A home, a wife, a child on the way, purpose, belonging." Their daughter was born on a clear autumn day, arriving with a lusty cry that Kieran swore could be heard all the way to Cedar Springs. They named her Grace for the blessing she represented in their lives. Holding his daughter for the first time, Kieran's face reflected a mixture of awe and overwhelming love. "She's perfect," he whispered, a tear trailing unashamedly down his cheek, "just like her mother." Katherine watched them together, her heart so full it ached. This was her family, the one she had thought lost forever when her father died. Different, but no less precious for that difference. As Grace grew, so did the prosperity of their homestead. Kieran's knowledge of cattle proved invaluable, and within 2 years their small herd had tripled in size. They hired help during the busiest seasons, and Kieran's fair treatment of the workers earned him a reputation as one of the best employers in the territory. Katherine, for her part, started a small side business selling preserves and baked goods in town. Her apple pies became famous throughout the county, and she often joked that she should have taken Kieran's advice about opening a restaurant in Tucson. When Grace was 3, she gained a brother, Samuel, named for Katherine's father. The family of 4 filled the small cabin with love and laughter, making it seem larger than its modest dimensions. As the years passed, they added onto the cabin, building new rooms as their family and prosperity grew. The barn that Kieran had repaired on his second day at the homestead remained strong, though they eventually built a larger one to accommodate their expanding operation. On the 5th anniversary of their meeting, Kieran surprised Katherine by taking her to the creek where they had first encountered each other. He had packed a picnic lunch and arranged for a neighbor to watch the children. "Do you remember?" he asked as they sat by the flowing water, the summer sun warming their skin. Katherine smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "How could I forget? I was struggling with those buckets, and suddenly there you were, offering to help." "Two hands make it lighter," Kieran quoted himself, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I was so suspicious of you," Katherine recalled with a laugh. "I thought you might be after the land or worse. And instead, I was just after your heart," Kieran teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. Katherine turned to face him, her expression growing serious. "I never properly thanked you, you know." "For what?" "For saving me," she said simply. "Not just from the physical labor, but from the loneliness. From the fear that I would spend the rest of my life alone, fighting a losing battle to keep this place." Kieran shook his head, his eyes warm with love. "You saved yourself, Katherine. You were already doing the impossible when I found you. I just offered an extra pair of hands." "And a heart," she added softly. "You offered your heart." The best decision I ever made, Kieran affirmed, drawing her close for a kiss that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made her pulse quicken. As they packed up their picnic and prepared to return home to their children, Katherine paused for one last look at the creek. It seemed smaller now than it had that day 5 years ago, less formidable. Or perhaps she was simply stronger, bolstered by the love and partnership she had found with Kieran. "Ready to go home?" Kieran asked, extending his hand to her. Katherine took it, their fingers intertwining with the familiarity of long practice. "With you, always." They walked hand in hand back to their horses, back toward the home they had built together. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal flow, a silent witness to the beginning of their story, a story that had started with a simple offer of help and had grown into a lifetime of shared joys and sorrows, of two hands making the load lighter, of two hearts beating as one. 10 years after that fateful day by the creek, the Blackwood Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. What had once been Katherine's modest homestead was now a thriving operation with dozens of employees, a sprawling main house, and a reputation for quality that extended as far as California. Grace, now 10, was the spitting image of her mother, with the same determined spirit and kind heart. Samuel, at 7, had his father's quiet strength and thoughtful nature. They had been joined by a younger sister, Emily, who at 4 was the undisputed ruler of the household despite being its smallest member. On the anniversary of their meeting each year, Kieran and Katherine still made the pilgrimage to the creek, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone. It had become a tradition, a way of honoring the beginning of their journey together. As they sat by the water on the 10th anniversary, watching their children play along the banks, Katherine marveled at how far they had come. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked Kieran, gesturing to their family, to the prosperity that surrounded them. "That day when you stopped to help a stubborn woman with her water buckets," Kieran smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with the expression. At 42, his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, but his eyes were as kind and clear as the day they met. "I hoped," he admitted. "From the moment I saw you, something told me you were special, that if I was lucky enough to be part of your life, everything else would fall into place." Katherine leaned against him, watching as Grace showed her younger siblings how to skip stones across the water's surface. "We've been blessed," she said softly. "Beyond measure," Kieran agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I received a letter yesterday from my mother." Katherine straightened, surprised. Though Kieran maintained correspondence with his mother in St. Louis, their communication was infrequent at best. "Is everything all right?" "Her husband passed away last month," Kieran said. "She's alone now and not as young as she once was." Understanding dawned on Katherine. "You want to invite her to come live with us?" It wasn't a question, but Kieran nodded anyway, "if you're agreeable. I know we haven't seen much of each other over the years, but she's still my mother, and the children should know their grandmother." Katherine didn't hesitate. "Of course she must come. We have more than enough room, and it would be good for the children to have her influence." Relief washed over Kieran's face. "Thank you. I'll write to her tonight." 3 months later, Kieran Blackwood arrived at the ranch, a dignified woman in her 60s whose resemblance to Kieran was striking. Despite initial awkwardness, they had, after all, been separated for nearly 20 years. She quickly became an integral part of the family. The children adored her stories of Kieran as a boy in Kansas, and she proved to be a skilled teacher, taking over much of their education with a gentle but firm hand. With Alina's arrival, the family felt complete in a way it hadn't before. She brought with her family heirlooms and photographs that connected Kieran and their children to a past they had never known, enriching their sense of identity and belonging. As the years continued to pass, the Blackwood Ranch became known not just for its cattle and crops, but for its hospitality. Travelers passing through the area often spoke of the warm welcome they received, particularly those in need. More than one drifter found temporary work and a hot meal at the Blackwood table, Kieran and Katherine never forgetting what it meant to extend a helping hand to a stranger. The children grew tall and strong, each finding their own path as they matured. Grace, with her mother's determination and her father's skill with animals, took a keen interest in the ranching operations. Samuel showed a gift for numbers and business that surpassed both his parents, keeping the ranch's accounts with precision from an early age. Emily, the youngest, revealed an artistic talent that blossomed under her grandmother's encouragement. Through it all, Kieran and Catherine's love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. They had disagreements, of course, as all couples do, about how to raise the children, how to manage the ranch, which direction to take when challenges arose. But they faced each decision as partners, honoring the commitment they had made to each other that day in the small church in Cedar Springs. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the entire community gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The small cabin where they had begun their life together had long since been expanded into a comfortable home, but they had preserved the original structure at its heart, a reminder of their humble beginnings. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Kieran led Katherine away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath the old cottonwood tree where they had shared their first lunch together. 20 years, he mused, his hand warm in hers. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you struggling with those water buckets. Katherine smiled, the years having only deepened her love for this man who had changed her life with a simple offer of help. And sometimes it feels like I've known you forever. Kieran reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I have something for you. Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Katherine opened it, she found a miniature painting of the creek where they had first met on one side, and on the other, tiny portraits of their 3 children. It's beautiful, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Kieran fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin with familiar tenderness. To remind you of where we began and all we've built together. Katherine touched the locket, then reached up to cup his cheek. I don't need reminders. Every day with you is a blessing I never take for granted. As they kissed beneath the cottonwood tree, the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the party, Katherine felt the same flutter in her heart that she had experienced the first time Kieran's lips had touched hers. 20 years had not dimmed the spark between them. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by shared joys and sorrows, by the family they had created together. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, they stood on the porch of their home, arms around each other's waists, watching as the last wagons rolled away. What do you think the next 20 years will bring? Katherine asked, leaning her head on Kieran's shoulder. He considered the question, his gaze taking in the prosperous ranch spread out before them, the fields they had planted together, the barns they had built, the home that had grown along with their family. More of this, he said finally. More love, more challenges, more growth. Grandchildren, perhaps. Katherine smiled at the thought. Grace was 17 now and being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher. It wasn't hard to imagine a new generation of Blackwoods running through the fields in the coming years. Whatever comes, Kieran continued, we'll face it together, just as we always have. 2 hands, Katherine murmured their old refrain. 2 hearts, Kieran completed, drawing her closer. As they stood there in the moonlight, the home they had built together warm and inviting behind them, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance meeting at a creek to a life filled with love, family, and purpose, all because a cowboy had seen a woman struggling alone and offered to help. 2 hands make it lighter, he had said that day, not knowing how those simple words would change both their lives forever. In offering to share her burden, he had given her so much more: a partner, a family, a future brighter than she could have imagined. And as they turned to go inside, to the home filled with the memories they had created together, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she would choose this path again and again. Every struggle, every joy, every moment that had led them here, she would embrace it all, for it had brought her to this perfect happiness. Hand in hand, they walked into their home, into the future they continued to build together, one day at a time. The years continued to flow like the creek where they had first met, sometimes rushing, sometimes gentle, but always moving forward. The Blackwood Ranch prospered under their careful stewardship, becoming a landmark in the territory and a legacy for their children. Grace married at 20. Her wedding held under the same cottonwood tree where Kieran and Katherine had shared so many important moments. Her husband, Thomas, was the son of a neighboring rancher, a kind and hard-working young man who looked at Grace with the same devotion Kieran had always shown Katherine. Samuel chose a different path, attending university in the East before returning to help manage the ranch's expanding business interests. His sharp mind and innovative ideas brought new prosperity to the family enterprise, while his gentle heart ensured that the Blackwood commitment to fair treatment of workers and neighbors never wavered. Emily, the youngest, surprised them all by becoming a respected artist whose paintings of Western landscapes hung in galleries as far away as New York. Though she traveled widely, she always returned to the ranch, drawing inspiration from the land that had nurtured her. As their children found their own ways in the world, Kieran and Katherine found new joy in becoming grandparents. Grace's 3 children were frequent visitors to the main house, filling it with laughter and energy that reminded them of earlier days. Eleanor Blackwood lived to see her great-grandchildren, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by the family she had come to love deeply in her final years. Her presence had been a blessing, bridging the gap between past and future, helping Kieran heal wounds he hadn't realized were still open. Through it all, Kieran and Katherine remained each other's strength and solace. The passion of their early years had matured into something deeper, a love tempered by time and shared experience, by the countless small gestures of care and commitment that made up a lifetime together. On the morning of their 40th anniversary, Katherine woke to find Kieran already up, standing at the window of their bedroom, gazing out at the land they had nurtured for so long. At 72, his once dark hair was now completely silver, his tall frame slightly stooped, but to Katherine, he was as handsome as the day they'd met. "What are you thinking about so early?" she asked, joining him at the window. Kieran turned to her, his eyes crinkling with the smile that still made her heart skip. "About how lucky I am, how one decision, one moment can change the course of a life." Katherine took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as they had countless times over the years. "The day you stopped to help me with the water. The best decision I ever made," Kieran affirmed, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I didn't know it at the time." Later that day, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The original cabin, now preserved as a cherished family monument, was decorated with flowers and lanterns, a testament to the humble beginnings from which so much had grown. As the family shared stories and laughter, the youngest grandchild, 5-year-old Katie, climbed onto Kieran's lap with a book. "Grandpa, tell me the story again," she pleaded, her eyes so like Katherine's wide with anticipation. "Which story is that, little one?" Kieran asked, though he knew very well which tale she wanted to hear. "The one about how you met Grandma." Kieran glanced at Katherine, seated nearby, and the love that passed between them was as tangible as the day they wed. "Well," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "It was a hot summer day, and I was riding through this very land which didn't belong to us yet." As Kieran recounted their meeting, Katherine watched the faces of their family children, grandchildren, in-laws all listening with the rapt attention that comes from hearing a beloved family legend. The story had been told so many times that it had taken on the quality of a fairy tale, though its truth was evident in every aspect of their lives together. When Kieran finished the tale with their traditional phrase, "Two hands make it lighter, two hearts make it stronger," Katie sighed with satisfaction. "And they lived happily ever after," she added, completing the story as she had heard it many times before. "Yes," Kieran agreed, his eyes finding Katherine's across the room. "We certainly did." That evening, after the family had departed and the house was quiet once more, Kieran and Katherine walked hand in hand to the creek, as they had done every year on their anniversary. The path was well-worn now, a testament to the tradition they had maintained through decades. Though their steps were slower than in years past, There was a dignity in their measured pace, a quiet pride in having walked this journey together for so long. At the creek, they sat on the bench their children had built for them on their 30th anniversary, watching as the setting sun cast golden light across the flowing water. 40 years, Katherine mused, leaning against Kieran's shoulder. If someone had told me that day that the stranger offering to help me would become my husband, the father of my children, the center of my world for 40 years, I would have thought them mad. Kieran chuckled, his arm warm around her shoulders. And if someone had told me that the stubborn woman insisting she could manage on her own would become my partner in all things, my greatest joy, I might not have believed them either. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the gentle murmur of the creek, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "Was it everything you hoped for?" Katherine asked softly. "This life we built together?" Kieran turned to her, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "It was more," he said simply. "More joy, more love, more purpose than I ever dared to dream possible." Katherine's eyes filled with tears at the sincerity in his voice. "For me too," she whispered. As darkness fell around them, they remained by the creek a little longer, reluctant to end this moment of reflection. The sounds of the night surrounded them, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, the eternal whisper of water over stones. "We should head back," Kieran said eventually, rising and offering his hand to help Katherine to her feet. "These old bones don't take to sitting on hard benches as well as they used to." Katherine laughed, accepting his assistance. "Speak for yourself, old man, I'm as spry as ever." Their banter continued as they walked slowly back to the house, their steps in perfect rhythm after decades of walking side by side. The main house was lit with a warm glow, welcoming them home as it had for so many years. On the porch, Kieran paused, looking out over the land that had been the setting for their life together. In the moonlight, the outlines of barns, corrals, and outbuildings were visible physical manifestations of all they had built from nothing. "I've been thinking," he said thoughtfully. "About that foreman job in Tucson I never took." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "Regretting your choice after all these years," Kieran smiled, shaking his head. "Just the opposite. I was thinking about how one decision, one moment of listening to my heart instead of my head led to all of this." He gestured to the prosperous ranch spread out before them. "To you, to our children, to a life beyond anything I could have imagined for myself." Katherine stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. "Even after all these years, they fit together perfectly. That's the thing about life," she murmured. "The most important crossroads don't announce themselves. They look like ordinary moments, ordinary decisions." "Like offering to help a stubborn woman with her water buckets," Kieran added, his voice warm with affection. "Like accepting help when pride says you shouldn't," Katherine countered. They stood together on the porch for a few moments longer, two figures silhouetted against the warm light spilling from their home. Then, with the easy synchronicity of a couple who had moved through life together for 4 decades, they turned and went inside, closing the door on the night. In the bedroom they had shared for so many years, Katherine fingered the locket Kieran had given her on their 20th anniversary. It still held the same tiny paintings, the creek, and their children's portraits, though the gold had been polished smooth by years of touch. "I think about it sometimes," she said as they prepared for bed. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't stopped that day, or if I had sent you on your way." Kieran came to stand behind her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," he said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be." Katherine turned in his embrace, looking up into the face she had loved for so long. "Two hands make it lighter," she said softly. "Two hearts make it stronger," Kieran completed, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. As they settled into bed, the familiar comfort of each other's presence was the greatest blessing of their shared life. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it as they had faced every day for 40 years together, their hands and hearts united in the bond that had begun with a simple act of kindness beside a desert creek. And in that unity was the truest happiness either could have imagined, a love that had withstood the test of time and had only grown stronger with each passing year. It was the legacy they would leave to their children and grandchildren, not just the prosperous ranch or the material comforts they had worked so hard to provide, but the example of a love that endured, that found joy in service to each other, that saw each burden as lighter when shared. Two hands. Two hearts, one remarkable life together.